when it comes to AliExpress, I have tried a lot, but by no means have I tried it out. And some of my favorite companies are always releasing new variations on an old song. So today, we're going to check out a couple of those variations. First off, we have the DorerArt Watercolor postcards. So these are smaller, non-block bound watercolor rounds. These would be cellulose paper rounds. And then we have the Mairtini watercolor block. So am I going to like these better than the originals? Am I going to find that these are much worse? I don't know, but I'm really excited to find out. So what I want to do with you guys today is we are going to mud test both pads of paper to see how well they handle to regular watercolor techniques and loads of water and loads of pigment. And then we are going to field test both of these papers. So this is a long one. Strap in and let's find out if the DorerArt watercolor postcards and the Mairtini watercolor block are worth their salt. Hey there, art nerds. I've got another It Came from AliExpress. So today we are taking a look at the DorerArt watercolor postcards and the Mairtini watercolor paper. If these look kind of familiar to you guys, it's because I have reviewed them in the reverse form in the past, and I like them well enough to give them a shot in a new format. So I originally reviewed the Mairtini watercolor round. So these are a mixed fiber round, 25% cotton, and the rest is cellulose. I originally reviewed these little watercolor rounds and used them for a lot of my super granulating field tests. So we're taking a look at their block bound version of the same thing today. And I originally reviewed the DorerArt cellulose based watercolor block that is bound. And today we're actually taking a look at the loose round. So kind of neat, we've got a little switcheroo. So I figure I am going to like these because I like them in these other formats. That's why I spent the money on them like this, but I thought I would share this with you guys anyway if you're looking for more round watercolor paper options. So these were purchased on AliExpress a while back. I will have the prices, if they are still available, in the description as well as in one of the voiceovers. Now with the Mairtini, this is getting increasingly difficult to find their paper. In fact, I was originally going to reorder this because I like this just fine and I was using it for my super granulating tests, and I couldn't find it for love or money. So that's why I ended up going with the block bound rounds. And that's also why I ended up going with the DorerArt rounds. So this doesn't say anything about what they're made of, but since I am familiar with the DorerArt round watercolor paper to begin with, I would bet these are cellulose based. These do. It says 25% cotton, German paper pulp. So this is going to be a mixed fiber paper. And that's good to keep in mind because mixed fiber papers do not behave. I say they behave like the worst of both parent papers. So it's definitely something you want to kind of be aware of going in. Now the Mairtini is a little bit better than, say, the Fabriano Studio, which is great for inking, not the best for watercolor. This is entirely a cellulose paper, and I found that the DorerArts performed decently well with alcohol markers as well as with watercolor. So as long as you kind of tame your expectations for what you can do on this paper, it should be able to meet what you're looking for. So this is available in a few different formats, both in terms of different color tins as well as in a square with rounded edges format. Very cute. This is available in different colors, and it's random. One of them has the fish. In fact, I believe there are 4 different designs. 3 of them are safe for work. One of them was not safe for work or YouTube, and you don't get to pick. And guess which one they sent me? So that's why there's an Art Snacks sticker on there. They are both shrink wrapped in plastic, which isn't really super necessary, but you know, I do appreciate that they aren't heavily packaged, and they did come in a bubble wrap mailer. I can't remember if they arrived in the same package or if they arrived separately, but I know they came with other art supplies that I'd ordered. This one is slightly dented. This one has to be handled, let's say, with care so that I don't get demonetized and I don't get flagged. So I'm gonna carefully open it and replace my sticker to hide the no-no bits. Okay, so this is a block bound paper, and it has a piece of craft paper to protect the paper underneath. And rather than a glue binding like we've seen with some of the less expensive watercolor rounds like this, we do have kind of like this black wax-esque binding, and this can be removed using a palette knife. So once you know the trick, you've got it. And then on the back, there is a little bit of additional information, including their website and their telephone number. If you feel like deciphering this, if you want to use Google Translate on it, by all means go for it. But since I have reviewed Mairtini products here on the channel before, I'm going to skip that today. And then inside this adorable tin, I'm actually kind of impressed. This is blue on the inside as well as on the outside. That's kind of surprising. Aha, so much like the Mairtini, and it honestly, the Mairtini is slightly bigger, but it also includes some foam to make it look like you're getting more paper than you're getting. It does say how many pieces, right? 24, yeah. It does say how many pieces you're getting, but the foam insert does make it look a little bit more impressive. And then you're getting 20 with this one. So what I want to do today is the same thing I do with all of my paper reviews. We are going to do a 3-layer mud test over the course of 3 days. And what that means is we're going to secure it down either by taping it or by testing out the block that it comes on. We are going to apply a really wet wash of water and paint, let it dry fully, come back the next day, apply another layer of the same, let it dry fully, and then come back a 3rd day and do the same thing. And we're looking for relifting, muddiness. Basically, we're just looking for misbehavior, right? If the paper curls up unreasonably, if the water just pools on the surface and doesn't go anywhere, if the paper breaks away from the block, those sort of problems. So that's what we're going to be keeping an eye out for today. One is a fair amount of prep work. So we're going to tape this down with some Japanese artist tape. I don't remember exactly what brand this is, but I got it on St. Louis Art Supply, and I find that it does a really good job holding watercolor paper down. So hopefully we won't have too much pringling. Very quickly, I'm going to pull out the original Mairtinis just to show you guys a size comparison. They're about the same size as the original Mairtini rounds. So for this, I'm going to use the Core Mini Palette. I'm using high quality artist watercolors so that if we do have any problems or issues, we know it wasn't the paints doing it, but rather the paper itself. Now for our first day, you guys can see I have a lot of water on the paper, and while it does buckle and bow up a little bit, I found that there was really very little pringling or buckling despite that heavy layer of water. Now there was some uneven drying since it's cellulose, and water control is really important on the little Dorer Art Rounds. So for the Mairtini, I wanted to prepare it first, so I needed to remove this craft paper layer from the top. This is how you guys know this is a brand new block. I hadn't even had a chance to do that, and I'm using a metal palette knife to do this. It just removes it a little bit more cleanly, and it's really pretty easy to do. So I'm going to use the same paints, and I'm going to apply a really heavy layer of water using a watercolor quill. I found that for this first layer, it kind of takes the water and the paint strangely. I noticed some strange scaling with the phthalo blue. Since I'm using a professional grade set that I use all the time, and I've never seen that phthalo blue scale like that before, I'm going to assume it's the paper. Sometimes the first sheet on a pad can be kind of weird, so it's something to think about. I also noticed that the colors dried fairly desaturated. For the second layer on our little cookie, it took the second layer quite well. There was some interesting color layering, good color clarity, interesting granulation, and the paper still doesn't pringle too badly. The DorerArt paper takes water surprisingly well. Remove that out of the way and move on to our Mairtini again. So second layer, second day, the paper just really doesn't seem cut out for a lot of wet into wet. Not because the block doesn't hold, because it does hold well, but because the paper isn't sure what to do with the water and the pigment. A lot of scaling in the original problem area. You can see the chalky patchiness. Not sure if that's a defect in this paper or systemic throughout the whole block or what. And in some areas, colors blend readily, and in others, they're reticent to blend. It's strange that the cellulose DorerArt takes water and pigment better than the mixed fiber block that bound Mairtini. So move that out of the way and we'll move on to day 3. So I applied some masking fluid just to test to see if it would tear up this paper. I'm going to do that with the Mairtini as well, since this can be an important to know failure point and a common failure point with some of these papers. So for layer 3, I noticed that it did start to buckle a little and it finally pulled loose from the tape. It seems to handle layering well without too much reactivation and without the colors turning to absolute mud. So you guys can see I'm making a mess here on our little cookie, and I used a lot of water on this to really kind of try to stress test it. And if I could make it fail, I was going to make it fail so that we could see that, so we would know the limits of this paper. I'm doing a little bit of water cleanup with a thirsty brush, and we're gonna allow it to dry. And I love sharing the hyperlapses with you guys because it's really cool to see it dry like that. It's like magic. So day 3 of the Mairtini block. The paper does buckle a bit with a lot of water, and it tends to pool not just around the edges, which is kind of normal with round blocks, but also in the center. So water control is really important and helpful. The paper also dries unevenly. Some areas dry much faster than others, and colors seem kind of dull on this paper. The colors also seem darker, especially compared to the Dorer Art Rounds, where colors are more vibrant and granulation is more apparent. The colors don't seem to blend that well on this paper. It is day 4 of this Mudtest review. So the masking fluid has had a chance to dry fully. All that's really left is to remove the masking fluid and see if we have any issues with tearing. It does actually seem like there might be some issues with tearing, and definitely there's some issues with it lifting up the prior layers of paint. So this might be a paper. This is more of a problem than over here where it didn't tear it, but it did remove the prior layers of paint. And that's not something you want to see from masking fluid. You want to be able to mask off those layers and kind of build up that color. So this might be one where you only use masking fluid if you're trying to reserve the white of the paper, or you're just trying to you're going to paint on top of it, right? Like what I do with dewdrops or painting in ladybugs, that kind of thing. But it's not a good paper for what I do with the Stash Buster bookmark. Also, ooh, that's not great at all. The masking fluid pickup literally erases paint off of this, because since it's a cellulose paper, all the paint is sitting, even with a high quality paint, we use core for a reason, it's all sitting on the surface of the paper, so that makes it very easy to accidentally remove or erase some of the paint. Now, you might decide to use that as a technique, and that's cool, but I want you to know, be deliberate with it, right? Like, it shouldn't be an unhappy accident. It should be something that you discover and can utilize to your benefit. Now, I do use masking fluid somewhat frequently, but on something of this size, I wouldn't necessarily use it. Also, the masking fluid, I mean, some of you guys are probably watching me do this and you're probably like, you're scrubbing really hard. The masking fluid doesn't want to just stick to the pickup. In fact, I'll switch to a different pickup just to remove any kind of doubt. It doesn't want to stick because there's so much paint coated on top of it. And I only did one layer of paint, but since with cellulose paper, everything kind of stays on the surface of the paper, nothing really soaks into the fibers. It doesn't really surprise me that, yeah, you can see right here, it's erasing the layers of paint to the point where I don't want to continue doing it because it makes me feel bad that I'm erasing the paint. It bothers me. So that's definitely something to be aware of. In general, though, I was very happy with how these little DorerArt rounds have performed. I like them. on the blocks. They're really fun with like alcohol markers, and I'll link some of those in the description for you guys. So I'm definitely going to use these. It's just trying to figure out what the perimeters are, and masking fluid is not an area where it does well. But I was impressed that I could do multiple layers, that the color vibrancy is still there, and we can see some granulation. This paper, in my opinion, for the most part, punches well above its pay grade. It's much better than it should be. So I'm just gonna remove it from the block. I don't think there was like an inordinate amount of buckling or rippling. It's pretty flat. And I only taped it down. It's not like it was like block bound. So all in all, I'm pretty satisfied with how this handled. So same thing goes for our Mairtini round. This is the mixed fiber paper. So there is some cotton in there, but it's only like 25% cotton. Now I've had some problems with this paper, although I do use it. I've used it in the individual cookies before. So it's really about figuring out your paper's shortcomings and then learning to work around them. There's a paper for every use case, and even a paper that's bad for certain things can be wonderful for other things. Like if you try watercoloring on Bristol paper, you might be very disappointed, but Bristol works really well with alcohol markers. Now, something I am noticing in favor of this, despite it having a myriad of problems, is we can very cleanly and easily remove our masking fluid, and it still retains a lot of the color intensity and brightness. And another plus, I don't seem to be erasing the masking fluid. I'm sorry, erasing the watercolor as I'm lifting up the masking fluid. Oh, I spoke way too soon. It's lifting it up here. So that seems to be kind of a doing that there too. A cellulose watercolor paper problem. I haven't really noticed it too much with cotton rag papers. That's what I mean by these sort of mixed fiber papers often have the worst traits of both parent fibers. You're really working around the weaknesses of both cotton rag and cellulose papers when it comes to mixed fiber papers. So to me, it's almost better just go full cellulose or full cotton rag, and then you have a better idea of what you're working with. I don't really understand why companies think a mixed fiber is appealing, but you know, if you have a different opinion, if you prefer mixed fiber papers, let me know, and let me know what I'm missing out on. I do find these kind of papers can be a lot of fun to ink on, and a lot of fun to do like traditional spot color techniques where I'm using a brush pen to fill in spot color. So they do have their place and they can be a lot of fun. But if I'm lifting up watercolor, removing the masking fluid, and I am trying to be pretty gentle, that's a pretty big problem. Let's talk about pros and cons. We're gonna start with the DorerArt watercolor postcards, and then we're gonna move on to the Mairtini block. So the pros of the DorerArt cookies are that they take water well and they hold color well. The color remains vibrant and pretty, and this is after 3 layers and me trying to make mud. You can do layers without it turning to mud. Speaking of, it didn't buckle too badly when I added a lot of water, and surprisingly, it dried flat. It didn't pringle. And I mean, it comes in a cute storage tin. Now, some of the cons are that being cellulose, water does sit on the surface rather than soaking in. That also means pigments sit on the surface rather than soaking in. So you're gonna have to be careful about water and pigment control. And you're also going to be limited to some degree with how many layers you can do and how frequently. I would say it handles around what Montvol handles, but is a lot thinner. It's almost the weight of a 90-pound paper. So there's stuff you can do on it, but I wouldn't push it too far. Now, I do know from experience that it does take alcohol marker decently well, and I'll include some clips for you guys to check out so you can see what I'm talking about. And that's probably what I'm going to use these for, is like alcohol marker with a little bit of watercolor on it. I think that would be really cute, especially in this very accessible but impossible to frame format. You're gonna have to do floating frames for anything with art like this. So what about the Mairtini block? Well, let's start with the pros. Let's start positive. The block held tight. It didn't buckle or peel off. And if you guys have watched some of my other watercolor paper reviews, you know, like the Sennelier block had big problems with that happening. It just can't take a lot of water. This one could. And the masking fluid didn't remove all the pigment. Unlike with this one, you can't really use masking fluid too much with this one because did I read the cons for this? I don't think I did. Give me a second. Sorry about that. So being cellulose, water sits on the surface rather than soaking in, and masking fluid removes color from the round. So it doesn't actually just mask, it removes some of the color. And the color lifts when you use a masking fluid pickup to remove the masking fluid. It's like you're erasing the color, and that could be used intentionally. So back over to this one, talking about the pros for that. So the masking fluid doesn't remove all the pigment. We do still get some bright saturated color. That's kind of the point of masking fluid, is to mask off areas you want, and you should be able to build up layers and build up color. That's something I do all the time in my Stash Buster series. So what about the cons? Well, at the risk of getting in trouble, the cover is too spicy for YouTube, and you don't get to select your cover. It's randomized. This is a problem if you're buying this for class use and you're a younger artist, or if you're buying this for somebody. While this is a beautiful piece of classic art, it isn't necessarily something you would feel comfortable with bringing with you to 12th grade art class. So the fact that you can't select your cover is a little bit concerning. It's also a mixed fiber paper, and mixed fiber papers tend to have the worst features of both fibers. It is both cellulose and cotton rag, so it's got a lot of the problems of both cellulose and cotton rag. The color pooled strangely, and a lot of the color there's a lot of color blowback, like you can see here, which looks pretty now, but it's the result of I couldn't control, like there was like, with this paper, when it got really wet, it creased right here. Not really sure why, because usually with round blocks, the water likes to pool around the edges and it kind of puffs up, but there is just a deep crease there, and that's where the water pooled. So you get a lot of color blowback rather than color mixing. If it was something you could control a little more easily, I could see you using it as an intentional effect, but because it's kind of I think there's like a fault line in the paper, you don't really get to choose where that's going to be. So you have to, if you're going to utilize that as an effect, you kind of have to work along that. There's weird patchiness, especially up here, which is really reminiscent of optical brighteners, but that's why I use the core palette. It's a high quality professional grade palette, so I know they're not using a lot of optical brighteners to make those paints seem more appealing than they actually are. So I think it's a problem with the paper. Maybe it's a bleaching agent they used. Maybe it's a sizing agent. There's a lot of areas where there could be a problem, but this was a new pad and you guys saw me remove the cover. So I don't think it's just, it got dirty from sitting in my studio for a while. As I mentioned earlier, the paper warps kind of strangely on this block, which is difficult to control, and it makes it not predictable, which is not a good thing. A lot of the color just sits on the surface rather than soaking in. So this is 25% cotton rag. Realistically, we'd like to see some of that color soak into the fibers. We'd also like to see the paper stay open longer, like a cotton rag would. But with this paper, because it's mixed fiber, there's some areas that stay open. There's some areas that dry really quickly. It just makes for an unusual, to say the least, painting experience. And the colors layer very dully. Like, let's just compare the two. These were both done with the same palette. I tried to use the same colors. I was really trying to see how the colors would mix and how we'd get granulation. On the full cellulose DorerArt paper, the colors are much more vibrant than they are on the mixed fiber Mairtini pad. And then finally, the masking fluid pickup removes some of the pigment when you're removing masking fluid. So you're going to get kind of like eraser lines on your paper. And I haven't really seen that before. That's an unusual one for me. So that happened with both of these. It's definitely an area for concern. I know some artists can use their fingers and just kind of scrape up masking fluid. That doesn't work for me, but I have seen artists use this weird like silicone tool. If you guys know what that is, that might be a better way to like remove really small areas of masking fluid without potentially messing up your paper. So if you know what I'm talking about, let me know what it's called so I can actually get one. So since this has fully dried, I can remove it. I'm gonna slip a palette knife underneath the opening. And then we can see whether it damaged the pages beneath. And it did not, which is good because I have reviewed some watercolor blocks where the water seeps through the paper and ruins the paper underneath. If you're gonna use alcohol markers with this though, I would recommend you go ahead and you remove your paper from the block because alcohol markers do have a tendency to seep through, and that way you're not just wasting paper. So what's my verdict for the DorerArt watercolor postcards and the Mairtini watercolor block? Well, as you guys know, I reviewed the DorerArt block a while back and the Mairtini individual rounds a while back. And honestly, my opinions haven't really changed all that much. I ended up using this whole pack doing field tests, so I found a use for these that I like. I'm sure I will find a use for this that I will like, but I am going to kind of do a modified version of what I normally do, sort of like with Fabriano Studio. I don't like really watercoloring on Fabriano Studio, but I really like inking on it with a brush. So that might be a similar fate for this block, is just kind of limit how I handle. And then for this, while it takes watercolor okay, it takes alcohol marker decently well too, so it's fun for mixed media without totally draining your alcohol markers on a cotton rag paper. So that's probably what I'm going to use these for, is to make some cute little mixed media mini illustrations that will then be impossible to frame, but I'm sure you'll be able to find them in the Natto shop when I have them. So they're fine, they're fun. I think if you go into it knowing kind of what you're getting a hold of, then you'll be happy with them. But they are papers that have unique needs, and you do need to kind of modify what you're going to do with them. If you do a lot of layers of really heavy watercolor, neither of these pads is really going to make you happy. But if you're willing to kind of pull back and do it a little bit lighter, I think both of these pads will be able to deliver what you need from them. I mean, I used almost all of these for field tests. So there's at least 25 little mini field tests in here. And it worked fine for that. It did the job. It showed off the granulation. It gave me an idea of how it might handle for my comic pages. So I felt very satisfied with what this was able to deliver. And I've used this with alcohol markers and was really charmed with the results. So I can see, as long as I kind of stick to what I know they succeed at, I can see myself making art that I'll be happy with. Speaking of art that I am happy with, I am so incredibly proud of all the work that I've put into my books. From Lilliputian Living, which is a compendium stupendium of tiny life, 4 years worth of inked prompts with a little bit of written description, world building here. This would be a perfect addition to anybody's library who has a big imagination, who enjoys looking at the world from a new perspective, or for tabletop gamers who are interested in trying out a totally different tabletop experience. This could be a great addition to that bookshelf. And then, of course, my baby, the reason I watercolor and the reason I did all these field tests, 7-Inch Kara, my watercolor comic. And you can read 7-Inch Kara at 7inchkara.com, or if you're a fan of owning your own books, if having them on the shelves makes you happy, if you enjoy being able to read something over and over again, whether it's in the car or in the tub, or if you would like to read this book together with somebody you love, you can order copies of Volume 1 and Volume 2 in the Natto shop. And I would be more than happy to write a dedication or a little message in the front of the book, whether it's for you or you're giving it as a gift. And what's really cool is that Volume 2 has a big section on making comics. So if you're interested in making comics, or you know somebody else who's interested in making comics, I've got a lot of great how-to information in the back of Volume 2. Often when I use DorerArt watercolor paper, I like to do kind of a mix of alcohol marker and watercolor, so I decided to do that with this one as well. I'm doing an underdrawing using red lead just to kind of get the concept in and to kind of figure things out. I'm not going to ink it until basically the end of the piece, so we're going to marker right on top of it, and it's going to give us kind of a disappearing line art sort of effect.
I'm going to have the markers as well as the colors that I used listed down in the description below, but it's a combination of Copic and Blick Studio markers for the most part. I'm also going to use my Daily Driver watercolor palette to paint this. So I'll have all of those linked down in the description, so make sure you check it out. I found that this paper takes alcohol marker pretty well. I don't really have any particular notes. It was fun to color on this paper. However, in a mixed media application, we start to see some problems. I'll get to that a little bit later on. Since this is a cellulose watercolor paper, it is going to have a slight texture. I know some people don't like that with their alcohol markers. I love it with my alcohol markers. So to me, that is a feature, not a flaw, but it is something I wanted to disclose for my friends who are thinking about this as an alcohol marker paper. It is a thirstier paper than coated papers and many marker papers, but if you use Bristol, it's kind of similar in terms of thirstiness to a Bristol paper. So it's a little thirsty, but it's not going to absolutely drain your markers immediately. This smaller size is also a lot of fun to use with alcohol markers because you can get some really immediate and quick art. It's just very satisfying and allows you to make a little something without making a huge commitment. I frequently use alcohol markers on my DorerArt block. I have a lot of videos and tutorials where I talk about that here on the channel, and I'll link those in the description for you guys. So this wasn't me trying something just like crazy new. This was me doing something that I figured the DorerArt cookies would handle decently well, and that this was probably well suited to the paper and to the sort of techniques that I had in mind. Although I do a lot of watercolor on this channel right now, I really love using alcohol markers. I think they're very fun and very immediate, and it's always a joy to get to pick them up and use them again. I do want to point out, just in case you're not super familiar with them, that they are a dye-based marker and that they are not going to be archival or light fast. So creating art like this, it's not really to sell the original piece. It would be maybe to make stickers out of it or to turn it into something else and then reprint it and reproduce it. So it's not really for the original that we're making this. We're more using this as a tool to create an illustration that we can use for other things. So really no notes about using alcohol markers on this paper. It was a joy to use. I flip it over, not too bad bleed through since it is a thicker paper. And I'm going to use the same artist tape to secure it to our chipboard. I'm actually using a little bit more this time because I really don't want it to pringle on me or to buckle up. I want to be able to have water control. So I'm adding in just kind of like, I wanted like a sun dapple effect. And something I noticed is that the alcohol marker really negatively impacted how watercolor handles on these. So if you're going to do mixed media alcohol marker and watercolor, be really deliberate in how you add your alcohol marker. I noticed that I couldn't really blend it anymore. I couldn't really lift it out anymore. So there was some patchiness on the face. And despite trying to be supportive, the paper did pringle pretty badly. So I put some weights on top of it while it dried to get it to dry flat. Now, this is a problem because it can be more difficult to control your watercolor watercolor if your paper is buckling as you paint it. I don't know if I just added too much water and I tried to work too quickly, or if it was a particularly humid day here in Southeast Louisiana and the paper just wasn't up to the challenge. But I did throw a fair amount of watercolor techniques at this and played around with it and had fun with it. So while I do have some negative notes, that's really more of something for you to keep in mind if you want to use this for a mixed media application like I did, rather than genuine complaints. I had fun painting on it. I tried a bunch of different things on it, and I was still able to kind of get it to do what I wanted it to do in the end. If you're a less confident artist, I might say just limit it to one type of art technique, maybe just alcohol marker or just watercolor, rather than trying to do both. And that's me showing you guys how it pringled, and that's me showing you guys keeping it under weight so that it'll dry a little bit better. Once it flattened and dried, I did re-ink it a bit, or I did ink it a bit. This isn't re-inking, it's just inking using a Sakura Pigma FB. Now, I could have inked it from the start with this, but I wanted to really keep everything very light and very airy, and I'm really just using the inks to kind of clean things up and define things, to add some contrast and some clarity, rather than creating a straightforward line art for this particular illustration. My advice is if you're going to do intensive mixed media techniques, I would recommend you use their block bound paper over their cookies. But if you're going to keep things kind of light and airy with limited water, the cookies should be just fine, and they're kind of fun to draw and paint on. I enjoyed it, and it could be a fun way to kind of mix up your art supply arsenal and add a few different shapes to your art. For the Mairtini block, I wanted to do a graphite field test. So I have a digital illustration of a jam jar with some berries that I printed out, and I applied some soft graphite to the back. I taped it down and I impressed it onto our watercolor paper. I do actually have tutorials where I demonstrate how to do graphite transfers here on the channel. I'm cleaning things up a little bit and adding in some additional berries and some additional details. And then I am inking it with my Sakura Pigma FB, which is both Copic and waterproof, and it is one of my favorite brush pens. If you enjoy doing line art, I highly recommend it. I found that the Mairtini block, it took graphite transfer well, it is easy to ink on, and once I finish inking, I'm going to erase my graphite using a soft vinyl eraser, and that is after allowing the graphite to cure onto the paper for about 24 hours. This really helps prevent ghosting and smearing, and I found that when I erased it, the graphite erased cleanly with no real ghosting, and it didn't seem to tear up the paper either, which is really important if you're an illustrator like me and you want the ability to generate line arts either to share on Patreon, like I'm going to do, or to just because you enjoy generating line arts, or to create a coloring book. Really, creating line arts like this allows you more flexibility with your art and how you share it and how you distribute it. So it is an important aspect that I just genuinely enjoy. I enjoy inking. I find it very relaxing, and I would be kind of bummed out if this paper didn't take inking very well, but it does take inking pretty well. To start off with, I'm going to mix up a really wet toning wash of cerulean blue and ultramarine, and I noticed my first problem. As soon as I put on the wash of blue, I realized the edges were still dirty from the original Mudtest, and I had to do some cleanup to fix the situation. Cleaning it up is pretty easy, a wet paper towel around the edges, but it's the first time that's really happened to me and worth pointing out for y'all. The paper doesn't really handle like a lot of water super well. It starts buckling up, so I'm going to allow it to dry fully before applying another really wet layer. Fortunately, the glue binding is holding pretty well, so I'm hoping it will dry flat. Once I allowed it to dry completely, I'm going in with a slightly more saturated mix of our ultramarine blue mixed with our cerulean blue to do a little bit of blue grisé underpainting just to kind of start setting the tone for things. And then once that dried, I'm going to start blocking in some of our base colors, some of our blues, our yellows, start painting the bread, etc. So I wanted a kind of warm, late summer sort of illustration, and living in Southeast Louisiana, summer lasts well into October for us. It just stays hot here. So this would not be not seasonal for me, but if you guys are feeling fall vibes, I do have some more fall illustrations coming up soon that I hope you guys will keep an eye out for. So for the base layers, the yellows, the reds, the phthalo blue, the paper is easy to paint on and it's kind of fun. It reminds me a bit of Mont Val. It's an easygoing paper so long as you don't ask too much of it. It's easy to forget that I'm doing a field test and just fall into enjoying painting, which is a great sign. I held a couple of more illustrations to see if they'd even work on this paper. So I've got a couple more that I'd like to use on this paper that I haven't yet. I started with something simple that I thought would be pretty easy to execute. But since doing this illustration, I think I'm going to also do those. So please keep an eye out for that. Sometimes you just want a simple paper for simple illustrations, nothing too fussy or complicated. And this fits the bill if you're looking for something like that. And if the Mairtini block were easier to get a hold of, it could be a good fit. So once I finish blocking everything in, I'm going to allow that to dry overnight and then come back to it the next morning. So while I applied this Holbein's Hooker Green over our phthalo blue layer, I did notice some reactivation with our phthalo blue, which is concerning for a lot of reasons. It makes optical blending and layering more difficult and it can create some muddiness. So that's something I want you guys to keep in mind as we work on this paper. That's going to be kind of a reoccurring problem. And it's one of the issues that if you're going to use this paper, you should keep it in mind as you work. A positive is that I noticed that if it is allowed to dry, the paper does seem to dry nice and taut again. It seems to dry a bit faster than pure cotton rag, and it might be because it's a mixed fiber and the water isn't fully soaking in and saturating the fibers. I allowed it to dry overnight and I noticed that the paper did dry nice and flat and taut. So I wanted to start developing the color more and adding in additional layers. And this is where I really started to notice problems. You guys also see that I am trying out some masking fluid on this paper, just in limited amounts, not as much as I did on the Paul Rubens Mermaid, but I did want to mask out some areas to make it easier for me to paint later on. So the paper really likes to reactivate even if you've allowed it to dry fully, especially if the layer is a bit more saturated like the phthalo blue. While I don't love this, it's pretty similar to Mont Val and other good cellulose papers, so it's something I know how to work around. If you're hoping to get good wet and wet or layer over layer, this paper probably isn't a good fit for you. However, if you like spray techniques that really move the pigment around, this paper will do that for you. Maybe too much. The paper's texture is very paintable. It's a slight cold press, but not too assertive and not too difficult to work with. My smaller silver black velvet brushes are fighting me a bit on this paper, but that's more because they're too soft to really do what I want them to do at that size, rather than the paper causing problems. The colors dry mostly clear and bright, but there is some desaturation as they dry. You can really see that in the jam jar. It's about standard with other quality cellulose cold press watercolor papers. The paper took the masking fluid well, and later when I remove the masking fluid, we'll see that it removes easily with no tearing or pulling of the paper, but that might just be because I used it in a very limited capacity, which is what I would recommend if you're painting along with me. This paper is just good enough that I want to use the whole block, but since it's more challenging to find it, I purchased this off of AliExpress and I can't find the listings anymore. I probably won't go out of my way to track it down in the future. I find this format preferable to their cookies. The block binding removes a lot of the issues I had with the cookies and the way the cookies tended to dry, and the issues that drying issue, the pringling as I called it, caused with the painting. The water dries fairly quickly on this paper, but if you've really saturated the paper, it's going to take about as long as a full cotton rag. If you're into lifting and correcting techniques, this paper has you, but be careful because it's very easy to go too far. It takes watercolor pencil decently well. I allowed it to dry fully so I have a nice tooth to the paper, but if you build up layers, and it doesn't take much to do that, the paper starts to lose its tooth because the paste never really soaks in. It just sits on top of the paper, and then it's a little bit less effective for watercolor pencil. I found this paper to be receptive to gouache. I found it to be receptive to re-inking as well, which I do to just kind of tighten up some of those details and to add some of that contrast that was initially lost back into our illustration. So when removing it from the block, and I allowed it to dry fully and completely before doing that, I found that it removes easily with a palette knife and is still fairly flat, but there is a black ring of glue around it that's kind of unsightly and it doesn't peel off very easily. So if you're going to float frame something like this, and you should to showcase the format, you're going to remove that black glue first. A clear binding would be less noticeable, but I don't know if it would be more effective than the black glue that they actually used. That said, I really enjoyed painting on this paper, warts and all. It's weird that it's a mixed fiber paper because it handles a lot like a cellulose paper, so if you're used to painting on cheaper papers, you should be able to get what you want out of this paper. And I would say it's pretty comparable to the block-bound DorerArt in terms of just like limit what techniques you're going to use, keep things kind of simple, keep your layers kind of limited because the paper just really can't take a lot of layering and it's very prone to reactivation. That about wraps up the field test for both the DorerArt watercolor postcards and the Mairtini watercolor block. For both of these field tests, I really did enjoy working with these papers, although both of these papers do have some not inconsequential flaws and drawbacks that may not make them ideal for even most people's studio work, most people's work that they want to produce. And I can talk about that in a little bit more detail after you guys check out some of my other work on these social media sites. We already covered the pros and cons for both of these options earlier, and you do have a lot of options when it comes to round watercolor paper and round watercolor blocks. And we'll talk about some of the other options and how they stack up against these in just a moment, but the TLDR. So with the DorerArt, because it isn't in a block form, it's not secured, which we knew. They're not being sold like they are. It starts to really pringle up and curl. So giving it the support that it needs is a bit of a challenge. You don't want to tape around the edges unless you have a design that maybe could utilize that. But generally, you probably don't want to tape around the edges. You want that edge-to-edge painting. Unfortunately, finding a way to secure it is pretty challenging. Like its block-bound predecessor, it does take alcohol marker really well, but the markers seem to do something that damaged the paper, and it affects how the watercolor lays on top of it. When I initially worked on this little piece here, I was honestly really frustrated and disappointed with my watercolor control. I just wasn't able to do what I had in mind at the time. But a few months have passed. Honestly, I've been working on the coloring book, and I kind of feel a little differently about it. I really do like the piece now, but that initial frustration, that initial inability to do what I want hasn't quite left my head. So while I do really like the DorerArt watercolor paper just in general, and I will probably use this entire pack, I do think you need to be really strategic if you decide you want to use it with alcohol markers and with watercolor together, because it is going to affect your paper surface. I would say really just save the watercolor for things like very small details. You could probably get away with using gouache because it's opaque and you're not going to necessarily notice the areas where it kind of didn't take as well or it took way too well. That was much more noticeable with watercolor. But if you want to do a lift technique, it's not going to lift after you've added the marker, if you know what I mean. So if you do the marker first, it kind of damages the paper's surface, and you won't be able to lift that watercolor up once you've applied it after. So just be really kind of strategic in how you use your watercolor over your alcohol marker on this paper here.
Then with the Mairtini, I went for kind of like a straightforward watercolor illustration. I wasn't really going for anything particularly layered or particularly detailed. I wasn't going for any really challenging watercolor effects. It took the layers of water, the washes of water that I put down decently well, but you do want to let it dry fully because as it absorbs those washes, the paper really cockles up. So you want to give it a chance to dry taut. I tried to learn my lessons after the Paul Rubens Big Block, and I did use masking fluid on it, but very limited. And I didn't have any problems with the masking fluid, but with these mixed fiber papers, I really would not challenge it by trying to cover a large area with masking fluid. I just don't think the paper responds very well to it. I think it gets kind of warped out of shape when you remove it. I did notice though that colors are way too prone to reactivating on this paper. And that makes it really challenging if you want to do something a little bit more complicated or a little bit more nuanced. If you wanted to do the mermaid that I did in the Paul Rubens test on this paper, you'd have to go about it completely differently. This is probably great for really light, limited applications of watercolor, more airy, easygoing pastel kind of watercolors. And I'll probably test this paper out with that just so that I can know, just to justify having this pad of paper and not wasting it. But it really can't handle more layered watercolor applications. So if what I have said still sounds good to you, by all means get these pads. Another problem though is I can find this easily on AliExpress. I can't find this on AliExpress or Amazon. So I don't know if they're white labeling for someone else. Shoot, we may end up finding this pad of paper again real soon because I have the Cellulose watercolor pad. Now what I think this is, I got this off of Amazon. What I think this is though, is I think this might be a rebrand of the DorerArt because it's an acid-free cold press paper, which is typically going to be a cellulose paper like the DorerArt. But I look forward to kind of exploring this one with you guys a little bit later on. That's another video for another day. But we may end up seeing some of these papers rebranded, sold as white label products over and over again. That's really not uncommon. Okay, so let's talk extensively about round watercolor blocks and watercolor cookies because as you guys know, I'm pretty obsessed with this format, even though it becomes a challenge to scan and a challenge to frame. So I love that our options are increasing. I would love to see even more unique shapes offered on the market. Especially as we can like move away from like a fine art sort of scape where you have very limited sort of things you can do with your paper format because it needs to be more standardized. Not all of us wants to do that. Not all of us need to do that. So we have a bunch of options here. We have the Paul Rubens watercolor block. It's also available in a smaller one. It's also available in a finer grain. This is a mixed fiber paper. As you can see, if you watch the review as well, it does not disclose that on the packaging. I don't love that at all. The fact that it says cotton, but not cotton and cellulose or cotton and wood pulp is a big problem for me. That said, for the most part, I could do what I wanted on this paper. This paper really didn't throw a lot of problems. The only real issue I had was when I masked off a large area. And when I removed the masking fluid, even though it was applied when dry and removed when dry, I feel like it really tugged at the paper and warped the fibers and it never really dried nice and taut like it should. And I think that's more of a me thing than a Paul Rubens thing. I have never had good luck with like using masking fluid to cover larger areas. Some artists do. I'm always willing to try. But I think that was something I struggled with, but not necessarily other artists will struggle with. One thing I did notice is it did seem, once it finally absorbed the water, it did seem to take longer to dry out. And I also noticed that you couldn't really like lift on this paper. And that's something, those weird working properties, kind of unpredictable working properties is something that I have noticed with a lot of these mixed fiber papers. However, it is very economically priced. At least at the time that I reviewed it, it was like $15 on Amazon for the big block. So that can be a really good option. Now it's available in this size, and I've got a bunch of my examples over here. Let me just quickly flip through them. It is also available in this size, and another problem I noticed is that around the edges you get this ring where the glue that holds it in the block just kind of weirdly affects the paper. It is also an issue in the bigger round, but because it takes up more space, it's much less noticeable than in the smaller format here. And the smaller format has the same kind of weird, like I tore up the paper using masking fluid on this, and I forgot it in between the reviews. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. It's not really a masking fluid friendly paper. If you want to use masking fluid, use it in really limited, like masking off highlights in the water would be a good use for that. Then we have our cotton rag blocks. We have the Mairtini 1404, which is, I think, available in 2 sizes. It's also available in a larger one. It's kind of expensive, so I don't have that one. It's also available in a variety of finishes, kind of denoted by the name down here. I have their hot press that I want to try out as well because I really liked their cold press. This was painted on their cold press. Lots of layers, lots of masking fluid, inked on the paper. I had no problems. I really enjoyed painting this. I would be happy to own the larger pad. It's just kind of pricey, and I have a lot of watercolor blocks right now that I kind of need to work my way through. I purchased this at my local brick and mortar. They've got the bigger ones as well. That would be David's Art Center if you are a Louisiana local, but you can get it on Amazon. I'm sure you can get it on Blick, and they do have other block styles available if you don't want the round format, but this through absolutely no problems at all. It was a joy to paint on. We also have the Arteza block, and this is a 100% cotton rag paper. This threw so many problems. This is such a weird paper to paint on. So this is the resulting illustration. I'm really happy with how the resulting illustration turned out, but it was a fight. The colors wanted to lift up, similar to my problem with the Mairtini paper. It really didn't want to do a whole lot of layers. The masking fluid chewed up the stars. Basically anywhere I had masking fluid, I had to repaint it and re-ink it because this paper and masking fluid are not friends. I don't know if there's not enough sizing in it or what, but I can't quite tell you off the top of my head what this paper would be a good paper for. I'd like to play with it a little bit more. I'm sure there's something it's great at. It's probably great at like loose florals where you're not doing a lot of layers and you're not doing any masking. But if you have a more like illustration or even cartoony illustration style where you are using inking and you are using masking fluid and you are using layers, this is not such a good fit. All right, so then we have the DorerArt pad, and this one really surprised me because it's a 100% cellulose watercolor paper, and I just really like it. It's just kind of down for whatever you want to throw at it. So I'll show you some of the older pieces I've done on it. As you can see, I do like using alcohol markers and watercolor together on this paper. This larger format handled it a lot better. This was also, so she was done in marker. This was done for my patrons. She was done in marker, and then I watercolored like a grisé just to kind of create a toning effect on top of her. And then the background is entirely watercolor and masking fluid. And it works really well. This is also alcohol marker and watercolor. Similar premise, worked really well for that as well. This is the Derwent Graphitin Fieldtest, and I did a lot of underpainting using the Inktense because I felt like the Graphitin just didn't have the range of color and the color intensity that I was looking for. And while I don't love the Graphitin and I don't like the Inktense, I feel like this paper behaved really well for that. It's easy to ink on this paper. It's easy to erase on this paper. You can layer watercolor on this paper. This is a more simple watercolor illustration. It's just kind of like a holiday wreath illustration, and it's just simple layers of watercolor. If you're going to do just watercolor on this paper, it's really best to kind of keep it simple because since it's a cellulose, the pigments don't actually soak into the paper, so they can be prone to sloughing off. With the cookies, the postcards, but I call them cookies because they're round like cookies, it took alcohol marker really well, but I think I was too ambitious with what I wanted the watercolor to do for me on this. I should have kept it more simple, like with some of these other illustrations where the watercolor aspect is actually very simple, especially when it comes in contact with alcohol marker. I think that was my problem, but both are fun to paint on. The only problem is, like, as a postcard, I don't know that I can pop that into the mail unless I have a square envelope and I hide it in my square envelope. I could do that. That would fit, actually. So this was pretty fun, and it is pretty common. You can also find it in different colors. I don't really know if DorerArt, if the different color packaging really makes a difference about what's inside. You can also get it in like a square and a rounded corner format as well. And then here is the Mairtini block illustration. And then in here, I was using the Mairtini paper, kind of just to use it up, but also because it really reminds me of Canson Montval, which is what I do my comic pages on. The whole time I was painting this, I was thinking about Montval, which is a cellulose paper, and it's not bad, but it does, you have to handle it a little differently than cotton rag. So it works really well for my comic pages, but it doesn't necessarily work well if you want to do like really atmospheric illustrations. So that's why I decided to just go ahead and use this for my super granulating field tests, because since it is similar to Montval and has similar working properties, I felt like it would give me a good idea of what I could expect Montval to do. This is another, when it's not secured like this, this is another one really prone to curling and pringling. And my solution is just to flatten them out between, sandwiched in between pieces of paper in case there's any water in there, and then sandwiched underneath a bunch of heavy books just to flatten them out. So it's not, once they pringle, it's not impossible. It's just that the curling makes watercoloring it much more difficult than if it would just stay flatter like this. And it could be a sizing issue. It could be the mixed fibers just absorb the water at different rates, so it is more prone to curling. I don't know. If you guys know, you should definitely let me know down in the comments. So I did actually really like the Mairtini block. I liked it better than the Arteza block. And it should be pretty affordable, but it's really kind of a challenge to find, as I mentioned earlier. So if you are limited for choice and you want a similar painting experience, the Paul Rubens is more accessible. It's a very inexpensive block. It's available in a larger size, and it's pretty similar, although I can't say it's the exact same painting experience. I will also say that I forgot I was doing a field test with this one. I just enjoyed painting it so much. I made sure not to forget I was doing a field test with that one, and I took copious notes because I knew you guys would be interested, but it was a joy to paint on. I never really had to struggle to think about it, except for layering some of the darker colors and the reactivation problems I had with that. But you could, if you're working on it with that in mind, you could work towards that like it's a feature and something you want. And I'm going to just go ahead and apologize if you hear that buzzsaw in the background. I've mentioned this several times because it's taken several months for them to work on the house next door, but it was basically left abandoned after Ida to mold and mildew and rot on the inside. And now they're finally getting around to redoing it. And they are so close to our house that it's really hard to avoid the noise. So I hate that sound. I apologize if you also hate that sound. I really hope they're almost done with that house. So, yeah, I would love to play with this paper more and like really mess around with like the reactivation and the blending properties and like looser watercolor for that, because I think it probably does really well with that. And I'm really looking forward to checking out Magnani's hot press paper. Just haven't had a chance yet. I really like cold press in general because I do like that texture. But I've had a few good hot presses before, like Stonehenge's hot press is really fun to paint on, even if you're a cold press kind of person. And I'm hoping the Magnani paper is kind of similar to that, where I can get like a cleaner sort of illustration style, but still have those watercolor elements. And then, of course, we're also going to be taking a look at the Tavolozzo watercolor block in the near future. If you like to paint in the round, you have a lot of different options at your disposal, and all of these options bring something different to the table. Most of these options do a good job of holding the paper secure if they are in block form while you're painting, so that's one less thing that you have to worry about. And it also means you don't have to tape it down so that you can actually get edge-to-edge watercolor illustration. Unfortunately, some are more expensive, some really just struggle at their task, and some are a mixed fiber and may have unpredictable handling needs. But hopefully in today's review, where we talked about the Mairtini watercolor block and the DorerArt watercolor cookies, I was able to introduce you to something that piqued your interest or maybe inspired you to try something new today. If so, let me know down in the comments. And if you've got a favorite unusual watercolor product, whether it is a watercolor paper that does something weird, and please don't hit me up with Yupo. I know about Yupo. Me and Yupo are not friends. But something else that does something weird, let me know about that. An unusual watercolor paint, something that has interesting working properties, or just something that's new on the market, please, please, please let me know either in the comments or over on my art-centric Discord server, The Paint Box. As you guys know, reviewing art supplies the way I do, without sponsorship and without taking too many handouts from art supply companies, gets really, really, really expensive. But I feel that this allows me to offer a very honest and unbiased review because I'm spending actual money on these products, and that helps me stay accountable and helps me keep in mind what I, as a customer and a consumer, am looking for my dollar. If you enjoy my reviews, if you find them helpful, useful, and informative, there are a few different ways that you can help me continue to do what I do. The first is you can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. For just $2 a month, your support can really help go a long way. So don't think that $2 is nothing. If a bunch of people pledge $2, that enables me to buy the reviews, to buy the supplies that I review here on the channel. Not only do you get the warm and fuzzies knowing that you're helping me do what I do and helping other artists find art supplies that they're actually going to enjoy and helping other artists save that money, maybe helping you save that money, but you also get early access to reviews just like this one, as well as tutorials, both early access and backer exclusive. And you also get exclusive access to the materials that I create for the in-person classes that I teach. That includes printables, that includes handouts, that includes presentations. And you also get printable line art. So whenever I make a new inked illustration, I scan it and share it with my patrons in case they want to color along with me. So whether you want to support accessible and affordable art education, or you want to know what art supplies are the right ones to buy, or you want early access, the skinny on everything, or you love to color and you want those line arts, joining me over on Patreon is a great way to support the channel. Another way you can help me do what I do over here is by checking the description down below. I always have a link or several for the materials that I use in these kind of reviews and in these kind of tutorials, as well as you can get your own. If it's an Amazon link, it's an Amazon affiliate link, which means I see a small bounty and you don't pay any extra. So if you're shopping on Amazon anyway, why not consider using my affiliate link? That is the only affiliate link I have. I don't have a Blick, I don't have an AliExpress, I don't have a link for any of the other stores that I frequently review products from. So if you like what I do and you don't have a lot of extra money to spend, but you're going art supply shopping anyway, and you're doing it on Amazon, please consider using my links. And those links are actually good for anything. If you start with that link, whatever you buy in that shopping trip I see a bounty for that. So that is a great way to help support what I'm doing here on the channel, and it's always much appreciated. The final way that you can help me do what I'm doing here on the channel is by engaging with me, commenting on videos, hitting like, and sharing them with your friends either on Twitter or Facebook or Pinterest. Those all go a really long way to helping me grow an audience and do what I do here. So whether you have a lot of money to spend or no money to spend, I hope you'll consider supporting me and what I do here on the channel. And if you're new here and you like what I do and you want to make sure you see more of it, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell notification to let YouTube know that you're interested in what I'm doing over here in my studio. I feel like field testing both of these pads both of these papers really allowed us to explore what these papers have to offer watercolor artists and illustrators. So we're going to start with the DorerArt postcards, and I have our little round cookie of color here. So as you guys remember, we did alcohol marker and then we painted on top of it. And although I have used alcohol marker on DorerArt watercolor paper pretty frequently, it's a technique that I really like and one that I've used several times, I was a little disappointed but not surprised that the alcohol marker damages the paper a bit and changes how receptive it is to watercolor, especially in this smaller size that does tend to be more noticeable. I also was kind of disappointed by how much this little cookie pringled on us when we added a significant amount of water. And since it is not block bound, that means it's really important to secure it, or I don't know, just not care if it pringles on you. It's kind of a your mileage may vary sort of situation. So I would recommend in this format at this size, maybe keeping this for either lighter watercolor applications or for your alcohol marker art. I think this could be a delightful textured paper that pairs well with your alcohol markers. But I enjoyed using it and I look forward to making more art with these postcards. Now, can you actually mail these as postcards? I'm not gonna try, and I couldn't tell you. Probably if you put it in like a glassine envelope that was a little more standard size, it'd be easier to mail something like this, just because the size does kind of change how the US mail wants to handle it. But if you decide to try mailing it, let me know down in the comments. So what about our Mairtini watercolor block? As you guys have noticed, I've had to censor it. It did have other designs and I was not allowed, they didn't give us the option to pick what design. We picked it, of course, with my luck. As an art supply YouTuber with an all ages audience, they would send me the one I can't show on camera, because that's how these things work. Fortunately, I had an Art Snack sticker that was just the right size for it. So with this block, I was actually pretty impressed. I really liked how well the block held the paper in place. We didn't have any blowouts. We didn't have any emergencies. I was not quite as impressed with how the watercolor actually handled on the paper, mainly in that the way we handle layers would be very different on this paper than on a 100% cotton rag paper, but I still enjoyed it and I still found it preferable to several other 100% cotton rag watercolor round blocks that I've used in the past. So I will probably use the rest of the block. I am disappointed that I did search on AliExpress and I couldn't find the block anymore. Mairtini, why do you keep doing this to me? So, ugh. But on that note, I've actually got two other illustrations already prepared to use on this block. In fact, I have one of them in progress. It's already inked. It's a cute berry witch, since we are in spooky season, but here in Southeast Louisiana, it is incredibly hot despite the time of year. So I don't ever necessarily associate like Halloween with actually being fall, even though it is. In my mind, Halloween is that hot weather holiday where we dress up in costumes and sweat ourselves. So I felt like blackberries and blackberry bramble would probably be fitting for this. So this is actually what I'm working on now. I'm going to try to really use the paper to its advantage because it is so prone to reactivation and relifting. I think spray techniques on this paper could be really fun. So I look forward to trying that out on this paper soon. So what is my verdict with the Mairtini block and the DorerArt round watercolor postcards? Because if you guys will think back, use your minds, use your memory, exercise those brain cells, you'll remember that originally we were reviewing Mairtini cookies and DorerArt blocks. Are they better? Is it an improvement? I think in both instances, the blocks are an improvement on the individual cookies for how I handle watercolor. And that is with a lot of water and a fair amount of layers. And I will link, you know, all the relevant videos and resources in case you guys are curious, as well as to where you can get your own when you can get your own, down in the description below. I'll also have full show notes, so I heavily encourage you to actually check that description. I know smarter YouTubers than me also do it as like a pinned comment. I just never, the ADHD, I just never remember to do that. But you should check the description because you'll have everything you need down there. So basically, my verdict is that I prefer the block bound for both of them. It takes away a lot of the problems these papers have. Both of them, if you add a lot of water, they want to curve and pringle, and that makes water control and painting control a lot more difficult. I ended up doing a bunch of field tests on the Mairtini cookies. Like a lot of my super grand field tests were on those. So in the end, I kind of found methods that worked for them. But with the cellulose paper, that's a little bit more challenging. However, I really liked how it plays with alcohol markers, especially as someone who does like heavier, thirstier papers with my alcohol markers, and I do like a bit of that texture with my alcohol markers. So I was happy with both. I was satisfied with both. The only thing well, there's two things I'm not satisfied about really. One is that I could not choose my cover for my Mairtini. As a YouTuber, I would have picked the goldfish one. I really liked that one. It was cute and I wouldn't have had to censor it. And I don't like that Mairtini products are in and out of availability. I don't know what's going on with that. I don't know who is their manufacturer or who they manufacture for. So if you got the tea on Mairtini, if you can tell me more about this company, because I've had a hard time finding info about them, I would be very, very, very curious to know. And you can share that info with me in the Paint Box, my art-centric Discord server. And just like everything else, I'll have a link to that down in the description below. So I want to thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today and helping me field test these two very different watercolor paper products. If you enjoy my watercolor paper reviews, if you're a fellow comic artist or illustrator and you find them beneficial, I have more coming up that I look forward to sharing with you guys. So keep an eye out for that. And if you're new here, or even if you're old here, do me a favor and take a minute and check and make sure that you are subscribed. Click that subscribe button and hit the bell notification and let YouTube know that you want to hear more from me. So thank you guys again so much for hanging out with me. These kind of reviews are made possible thanks to my amazing patrons over on Patreon. I use the funds that is generated from Patreon and their donations to purchase the supplies that I review here on the channel. And even just $2 a month goes a really long way to helping me continue to do what I do, which is to make unbiased art supply reviews and tutorials for the general public. And if you join me over on Patreon, not only do you get early access to videos like this one, but you also get printable line arts. In fact, I have just finished scanning this one at 600 DPI and cleaning it up, and I'm about to share it with my patrons. So you get printable line arts in case you enjoy coloring, and you also get access to the materials that I create for my classes, whether it's presentations or handouts or principles or templates or references. So no matter where you are on the art spectrum, whether you want to support other people having access to art tutorials and art education materials, or you want to gain access to those yourself, or you enjoy coloring, I think I've got a little bit of something for everyone at patreon.com/NatoSoup. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again really soon with another review or tutorial. Bye guys!